So let's do some coding with the prototype pattern. Here's our class diagram. We have an abstract class called user, and it has simple properties of first name, last name, password, and username. And it also has two properties, business address and home address, which are of address object type. And the address object simply has address 1, address 2, city, state, and zip. Then we have a derived class of user called admin, and it implements the clone and deep clone method. Now, the prototype pattern is really not about the properties so much, but these clone methods. So our abstract class implements iClonable, and our clone method is on the iClonable interface. I've also added a deep clone method in order to show you the difference between a shallow copy and a deep copy. So it's really a pretty simple class diagram. The devil is in the details in the clone methods. So here's our user class, which again is an abstract class and implements iClonable. And our clone method is the implementation of that interface. And note that it returns an object. Because it's an interface and it's a generic interface that can be used on any object, it has to return an object as opposed to our specific type. We also have properties for first name, last name, username, password, etc., and then these address objects for home address and business address. And as I mentioned, the address class is a very simple storage class for address information. So our admin class derives from user, and the important part of the admin class are the two methods, clone and deep clone. Our clone method, that is the implementation of iClonable, simply calls memberwise clone. Memberwise clone can be called on any object. It will create, however, a shallow copy. So our address objects will be copied as references rather than going deep into the address objects and copying each individual property. And we'll see the effect of what that means when we actually run the example. So for our case, our clone method is just going to call a memberwise clone. I have another method called deep clone. In this case, I do the memberwise clone to get my base admin object, and then I turn around and I make deep copies for the home address. So I take the home address, create a new address object, rather than just copying the reference, and then set each individual property based on the home address value of this admin user. I do the same thing with the business address. And again, the important thing is that I'm creating a new address object rather than copying a reference. So here's our form design. We have a bunch of entry fields for the name information, the home address information, and the business address information. This is not a particularly user-friendly form, by the way. The important thing is that we'll demonstrate the different types of clones that we have. So we have a button that will actually create our user and the two different clones. Then we have an edit button that will make a change to our original prototype. Over in this area, we have some labels, and we'll just use these in order to read the clone and the deep clone to see what happens after that edit. In our form code, we have an admin user, an admin clone, which is going to be a shallow copy, and an admin deep clone, which obviously is going to be a deep copy. On create, we're creating a new admin object, and just setting all of the properties to the entries that were made by the user. For our admin clone, we call the clone method on our original admin object. And for the deep clone, we call the deep clone method. So nothing earth-shattering there. Our edit button is even less earth-shattering. We simply go through all of those fields and set the properties on our original admin object. When I click the read clone button, I set the various label texts equal to the properties on the admin clone object. And the read deep clone button, we again set the label properties, but this time to, you guessed it, the admin deep clone object. So not really complicated code at all here. So let's give her a run. So here's our app with our pre-populated fields because you don't want to watch me type. So I've now created my objects, and let's read the clone, and we can see the properties are as expected. And we'll read the deep clone. Properties are exactly the same. So let's make a change to the name. We'll give them a middle name, and we'll edit that. And we'll read our clone, and nothing changed in the clone because I made the edit to the original admin object. And when I read my deep clone, again, nothing changed. Great, that's exactly what I would expect. Let's do something with the business address. Let's get rid of that address to line. And again, we'll click Edit. Let's read the deep clone. Nothing changed. Great, exactly what I expect. How about the shallow copy? Whoops, there goes my address to line. That's because the shallow copy has a reference to the address object. It didn't make a full deep copy of it. If you can imagine this, both the original and the clone are sharing the same address object instance. If anything happens to either one of those objects, it will affect the other. So if I'm intending to pass a customer object over to another form or page that really shouldn't be editing the original object, and I have it linked up to a database so that any edits that happen to that object get stored into the database, but that copy isn't really supposed to be editing the original, you can see that really bad things can happen and your database data can be completely corrupted. If we're doing this, for instance, with credit card accounts, and we're letting them add credit card accounts, and we're cloning the prototype because we want to use the same billing address that they've used previously. If the credit card information is on a sub-object, and they edit the credit card number, and we've made a shallow copy, we're going to edit the credit card number of the original card that we copied. In which case, both of their credit card numbers are going to be the same, so the information from that original card is going to be lost. So they won't actually have added anything at all. They'll basically have created two copies of the same information for their credit card, not what they would have expected at all. So it's really important to understand the difference between a shallow and a deep copy. When you're implementing the iClonable interface, it's really important to understand the difference between shallow and deep copies. And in all likelihood, you're probably going to choose deep. The only reason not to is because of any kind of performance hit if you're creating a really complicated object and there's a whole lot of sub-objects that you're looping through and copying properties, and you just don't need to because it's a read-only thing that you're going to be passing. But you have to be aware that that clone method may be used for other purposes that you didn't foresee later on. And the people who use the clone method are not necessarily going to be aware of the details. So they may clone that object, make it writable in some way, and fully expect that that's going to work as expected. If you've done a shallow copy, there might be a problem there. So that's something to consider when you're implementing a prototype pattern.